Episode 21, Universal Citizenship, 210 to 219 AD. Welcome back to 202 decades. In 1776, on the same island Septimius Severus was attempting to completely conquer, the British historian Edward Gibbon published the first volume of his hugely influential The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. After covering Severus's ascent and victory over his rivals Niger and Albinus, Gibbon summarizes the character of the reign of Severus with more eloquence than I can match. In the administration of justice, the judgments of the emperor were characterized by attention, discernment, and impartiality, and whenever he deviated from the strict line of equity, it was generally in favor of the poor and oppressed. Not so much indeed from any sense of humanity, as from the natural propensity of a despot to humble the pride of greatness and to sink all his subjects to the same common level of absolute dependence. His expensive taste for building, magnificent shows, and above all, a constant and liberal distribution of corn and provisions were the surest means of captivating the affection of the Roman people. The misfortunes of civil discord were obliterated. The calm of peace and prosperity was once more experienced in the provinces. The fame of the Roman arms was revived by that warlike and successful emperor, and he boasted, with a just pride, that, having received the empire oppressed with foreign and domestic wars, he left it established in profound, universal, and honorable peace. Last decade, we saw the bulk of Severus's reign. Septimius himself was fairly hands-off when it came to governing. His praetorian prefect was busy running the empire, his jurists were busy developing legal theory, his wife was busy cultivating philosophy and literature, and his sons were busy fighting each other. As he felt his life coming to an end, he brought his family on one last military expedition. He hoped this British campaign would end their strife and bring them together in unity. That attempt at reconciliation went about as well as the conquest of Caledonia. Here's what we're covering this time. Part 1, 2 Goodbyes. Part 2, Be Harmonious. Part 3, Universal Citizenship. Part 4, Sole Reign. Part 5, Parthia one last time. And Part 6, Macrinus and Elagabalus. Part 1, 2 Goodbyes. Last decade, Severus and family brought a large army to Britain, repaired Hadrian's Wall, conquered the land up to the Antonine Wall, garrisoned that, then sent out to conquer all the land to the north. They reoccupied the remains of the forts built during Agricola's abandoned invasion 120 years earlier. Their attempts to pacify the rest of the country were difficult. The terrain and climate were tough enough, but the natives methodically whittled away at the Romans. Cassius Dio splits the natives into the Maetai and the Caledonians, but I'll just call them both the Caledonians for simplicity's sake. Losses to these Caledonians were never huge all at once. But through their constant guerrilla warfare, the casualties added up. In response, the Romans bunkered down behind the walls of their forts and only sallied forth to burn and terrorize the countryside. The pressure this terror created was enough to pacify many of the tribes. As the winter of 209 grew heavy, a peace was established. Severus felt a final victory was within his grasp. At least the lowlands of Scotland had been conquered. But the breathing room given by this peace reinvigorated the spirit of resistance. The Caledonian tribes soon violently revolted against the Romans, and the Severans had to return from the relative comfort of Eboracum back to the front lines. We, unfortunately, don't have good records of what happened in 210. With the betrayal of the peace, we're told the goals of the expedition shifted. Severus was short-tempered. No longer was mere conquest on the table. Extermination was the solution. That spring, Caracalla led out a punitive expedition from the Roman forts into the Caledonian countryside. His soldiers terrorized the villages, killing every man, woman, and child they could find. Today we would call it ethnic cleansing, or genocide. Killing every native Caledonian was one way to ensure peace. Ironically, it was a Caledonian in Tacitus's account of Agricola's campaign 130 years before who said, "The Romans make a desert and call it peace." And that's exactly what Severus now had in mind. This strategy of elimination continued throughout 210. The Romans continued to suffer from attrition. The Caledonians suffered through the devastation. Both sides dug in their heels. We don't know how much longer the Caledonians could have stood strong in the face of annihilation. They suffered through the devastation to their people and their land, but the pain wasn't entirely one-sided. They did successfully overrun more than one of the Roman forts. Still, the Caledonians were saved from continued extermination thanks to the worsening illness of Severus. As the year of 210 came to a close, Severus was carried back to Eboracum, modern York. His end was near. He didn't die instantly, but lingered on as 210 turned to 211. Caracalla and Geta's feuding, which had been put on the back burner while they were separated, roared back to the surface now. They would very shortly be sharing power. Some of our sources say Caracalla tried to get the upper hand by speeding along his father's passing. When these subtle attempts failed, he perhaps tried to get the troops under his command to mutiny and follow his lead alone. This also failed. The soldiers were loyal to Severus above all others. In early February of 211, Septimius called his sons to his deathbed and delivered to them this final message. "Be harmonious. Enrich the soldiers. Scorn all others." On the 4th of February, Septimius Severus breathed his last. His two sons, the 23-year-old Caracalla and the 22-year-old Geta, were acclaimed as co-emperors by the soldiers. When word of Severus's passing made it back to Rome, the Senate both acknowledged the brothers as co-emperors and deified their father. The empire soon discovered that it had been Septimius holding everything together while it all pulled apart. The imperial court quickly severed down the middle, each assistant or secretary or counselor picking whether to side with Caracalla or Geta. For the moment, hostilities held off. The echoes of their father's dying words, "Be harmonious," had not yet faded from their minds. The campaign to conquer Caledonia, though, quickly came to an end. Caracalla made a peace with the tribal leaders. The Romans withdrew from all of their forts in Caledonia and from the Antonine Wall, and gave up all the land between there and Hadrian's Wall. Surely they received guarantees that raiding south would end, but it seems like a lot of territory to give up for this promise. Yet, Caracalla was hasty in the negotiations. He wanted to get off the island and get back to Rome. He was willing to sacrifice a bit of mossy earth if that's what it took to remove himself and the army from Britannia. And so, Scotland, Caledonia, remained unconquered. The Romans would never send a serious force north to conquer it again. The soldiers required to undertake an endeavor like this will not be available again to the empire. Very shortly, the Romans will face wave after wave of existential threats, and the legions will be kept busy with tasks more important than conquering windswept hills and heath. If Severus had lived another year or two, Scotland may have been integrated into the empire. But the death of the emperor ended these Roman ambitions. Now that Septimius Severus has left the stage, let's take a moment to examine his legacy. Most immediately, we have to recognize the stability that Severus delivered after the death of Commodus and the year of the 5 emperors. He didn't allow the civil wars to drag on and cause long-term divisions in the empire. He was ruthless in his elimination of Niger and Albinus' close supporters, but once he was established in Rome, He was not one to fall into conspiracy, purges, or paranoia. His rule was firm, but steady and peaceful. That peace relied not on his pedigree, nor his charisma, nor any legal claim to be princeps. It was the legions who had made Severus their emperor. He had no legitimate claim outside of being backed by the legions and freeing the empire from a false emperor who had bought his way to the top. Severus wasn't fooling himself. He knew his only legitimacy was through the army. "Enrich the army," he had told his sons. And Severus had done just that. Keeping the legions happy was his priority. He increased their pay, increased their numbers, and allowed the soldiers to marry during their terms of service, and gave military legates more authority in the provinces. We have to step back, though, and question whether the army was controlling Severus or Severus the army. Even Julius Caesar and Augustus hadn't been able to tame the legions. They harnessed them, directed them, but they could never tame them or take them down a peg in pay or privilege. With his lesser charisma, Severus was even more incapable. To keep them happy, Severus granted them privileges and allowed a relaxation of discipline. As Edward Gibbon says of the Severan army, "Elated by success, enervated by luxury, and raised above the level of subjects by their dangerous privileges, they soon became incapable of military fatigue, oppressive to the country, and impatient of a just subordination." They became decadent, greedy, and politically self-motivated. At the same time, their fighting capabilities eroded. This was fine while there was peace. It may have even increased the stability temporarily. For now, there were few threats to the peace across the provinces. As a great leveler, Severus's attention hadn't been overly fixed on Rome or Italy. His rule saw good governance and prosperity even to the farthest provinces of the empire. On an administrative level, he broke up several provinces into smaller units. Britain and Syria were divided. These, of course, were the home bases of his rivals. The large number of legions stationed in each of these had allowed those governors too much power. Splitting them up reduced the forces any one governor could immediately tap into. However, it wasn't just these two provinces. Africa was divided as well. There was also micromanagement of where some border districts were governed from. For example, Lycia in modern Anatolia was moved from the province of Galatia to Cilicia. Severus did more than split or shift, he also granted new privileges. We talked last decade of his granting Alexandria a senate of its own and giving it considerable self-government. And across the east, he granted dozens of cities colony status. We also see a construction boom across the empire, especially in military buildings and roads, which Caracalla will continue. Perhaps energized by having a native son on the imperial throne, Africa saw a building boom in temples and triumphal arches. And I've so far failed to mention his campaigns on the Saharan borderlands, which protected the wealthy North African countryside from the ravages of raiders. Corruption in the provinces under Severus reached a nadir. The emperor would not tolerate the governors profiting unjustly from their position. He really put the severe in Severus. The governors acted with almost a focused anxiety on behalf of their subjects. Part of it was fear of complaints reaching the emperor, but the other part was that Severus hand-selected his legates and governors with particular care. Allow me to conclude this farewell to Severus with one last paraphrase of Gibbon. Until Severus, the emperors had shown respect and reverence to the Senate and to the framework of civil policy instituted by Augustus. But Severus spent his ripe years among the military, where the only framework was obedience to your commanders. His inflexibility didn't allow him to acknowledge the advantage of maintaining the Senate as an intermediate power between the emperor and the army. He disdained the politicking which dealing with the senators required. He commanded them when he could have just requested. He embraced his position as a conqueror and a sovereign. He openly exercised the duties once exclusively held by the Senate. And now a direct quote. "The contemporaries of Severus, in the enjoyment of the peace and glory of his reign, forgave the cruelties by which it had been introduced. Posterity, who experienced the fatal effects of his maxims and example, justly considered him as the principal author of the decline of the Roman Empire." So, for all his flaws, seen clearly in retrospect, the reign of Severus extended the peace and prosperity experienced from the Julio-Claudians to the Antonines, and now to a new Severan Dynasty. Whether his crass, cruel, and corrupt sons could continue the good times was an open question. Part 2. Be harmonious. The divided courts of Geta and Caracalla reached Rome after a race back from Britannia, a return in which they never dined together and each expected to find his food poisoned by his brother. In the city, they shared a moment of public unity when they donned the imperial purple and processed with their father's ashes to his final resting place beside Marcus Aurelius in Hadrian's mausoleum. This was a rare pause to their feuding. Unable to trust each other, they settled upon a division of the imperial palace between the two sides. Both used guards and barricades to ensure no one crossed the line without permission. The court and all the officials were split. Even the governors leaned toward one brother or another. A real inertia of governance took hold. They disagreed on appointments and even on court cases. Reconciliation was proposed frequently. Their mother, Julia, made her own attempts to unite the two emperors. All of this failed. It took the pleas of their mother to even get them to appear in the same room. Even beyond the court, factions formed. Geta had won the favor of the people in Rome and of the Senate. He presented himself as social, kind, cultured, and courteous. He was quick to befriend the elite of the city, in the baths or in the gymnasia. Caracalla went the other direction. He shunned the luxuries of Rome and cultivated for himself a more military style. After a few weeks of indirect squabbling, an idea was hatched to separate the brothers and end the impasse they found themselves in. They proposed splitting the empire down the middle, just like they had done to the imperial palace. Carcalla would receive Italy and everything west of Greece. Geta would receive the east. The plan was moving along when Julia intervened. She shamed her boys. How dare they divide what their father worked so hard to unite? Chastened, they quietly abandoned their plan. It looked like they would have to live with each other or kill each other off. Plots now grew like weeds. They tried to poison each other, but each was too careful for that to work. In the end, Caracalla resorted to bloodshed. But how to get Geta alone, away from his guard and his retinue? Julia Domna, their mother, was the answer. Caracalla convinced his mother to summon both of her sons to her apartment in private with the story that Caracalla wished for a reconciliation. His hopeful mother agreed. When Geta entered her apartment alone, Caracalla sprung his trap. Several soldiers leaped out from a hiding place and attacked Geta. He retreated to his mother's arms, but was still slashed and stabbed. Julia, covered in his blood, embraced her dying son. Geta died in her arms, just 22 years old. The deed done, Caracalla, with blood on his hands, ran to the Praetorian camp, shouting for all to hear that he had been attacked. The guard were alarmed at his story. He said he had been attacked by his brother, but had survived thanks to good fortune. The guard were skeptical, of course, and already rumors were blowing in of what had actually happened. They could have questioned the story, but in the end, they decided they liked the tale. Believe in it came with a huge donative for the Praetorians. This colossal bribe drained the treasury dry. The Praetorians escorted Caracalla to the Senate House, where the now lone emperor gave a fiery speech. He again claimed to have acted in self-defense. If the senators felt sympathy for Geta, let them forget it and instead recognize Caracalla's bravery. He pointed to other examples of fratricide in Roman history, including Romulus and Remus. Even Romulus had killed his brother. Most in the city had favored Geta, but what could they do now? With the soldiers and praetorians backing Caracalla, there was no use protesting. Now, alone at the top, Caracalla's first action was to purge his enemies. Many of his brothers and his father's supporters were exiled or killed. Even his father's physician, who had refused to hurry Severus's death, was executed. Geta was wiped from public memory in an act of damnatio memoriae. His name was scratched out from inscriptions and his face chiseled off of statues, frescoes, and mosaics. In a massive purge, the allies of Geta were hunted down and killed. We're told as many as 20,000 were killed in Rome. Even the women weeping for Geta, including his own mother, were warned to stop. Highborn citizens were targeted most. The last surviving daughter of Marcus Aurelius, who was the sister of Commodus, was executed. Pertinax's son was killed for making an unwise pun. Apparently, there had been a minor victory in the east against a tribe called the Getae, and Pertinax's son suggested that Caracalla add Geticus to his list of titles. Get it? Victor over Getae or Geta. The pun wasn't subtle enough, and he was executed as well. Even Papinian, the jurist, was killed in this purge, supposedly for refusing to make legal cover for Caracalla's murder. He said, "It is easier to commit than to justify parricide." It was at this point that Caracalla finally had his poor wife and the rest of the family of Plautianus strangled in Sicily. As you can see, the purge wasn't limited to Rome. Assassins were sent into the provinces to kill governors who were especially supportive of Geta. This cruelty and bloodlust expanded beyond the supporters of Geta. While Caracalla attended a race in the hippodrome, the crowd began to insult a charioteer he favored. He sent in his praetorians to attack the crowd, killing hundreds. The momentum of his murdering began to slow. Though his cruelty and murderousness would not sleep completely, they died down for a while. Part 3. Universal Citizenship. Sometimes people do a good thing for a bad reason. In July of 212, Caracalla issued one of the most sweeping reforms of Roman history for completely selfish reasons. This was the Edict of Caracalla, or the Constitutio Antoniniana. With this edict, the emperor granted Roman citizenship to every free person in the empire. We've spoken recently on this podcast about the steady expansion of Roman citizenship to broader and broader swaths of the empire's population. But this decree was more than an incremental step. Before the decree, less than 25% of the population was a citizen. After it, something like 70 to 80% were citizens. The remaining non-citizens were either slaves or foreigners inside the empire. We'll get more into those people in a second, but first, we should ask why Caracalla expanded citizenship so broadly. Was it out of his generosity, his goodwill toward his loyal subjects? Clearly, no. Or was it because he himself was the result of a union between two provincials, one from Africa, the other from Syria? And he wanted the people of those provinces and others to be truly Roman too. Again, no. That at least would have been a noble intention, something that would have fulfilled Emperor Hadrian's old aspirations to establish the empire as a Roman commonwealth. But no, none of that. Caracalla actually granted citizenship to help solve one of his problems. Cassius Dio, Caracalla's contemporary, puts it plainly. He made all the people in his empire Roman citizens. Nominally, he was honoring them, but his real purpose was to increase his revenues by this means, inasmuch as aliens did not have to pay most of these taxes. Some taxes in the empire were limited to citizens. Roman citizens had to pay a 5% inheritance tax and a 5% tax on the value of freed slaves. Non-citizens weren't obliged to pay taxes on this. As we just saw, Caracalla was in need of cash. He had just bribed Praetorians to back him and increased the pay of all the soldiers significantly. And he still needed money for all the fun stuff of being emperor. Public works, feasting, throwing games, stuff like that. His options were to cut spending elsewhere, increase the tax rate of an existing tax, or create a new tax altogether. His solution is actually genius. Real outside-the-box thinking from whoever gave him the idea. Aside from modestly increasing tax revenue, the expansion of citizenship came with a few other pluses and minuses. First, all free men were now eligible to join the legions, massively broadening the potential pool of recruits. Some historians argue this was Caracalla's real motive for the decree, and Cassius Dio's just off base. A downside, though, is that this edict also removed a key incentive to join the army. No longer would the incentive of gaining citizenship by serving in the auxiliaries motivate the provincials. But the increased pay and the pension of land or cash after service still enticed many. Lastly, administration in the provinces became much simpler. No longer would there be two tiers of justice, one for citizens and one for non-citizens. Everyone, in theory, would get the same treatment. This was a momentous occasion in Roman history. The completion of a process that began with the granting of rights to Latin cities near to Rome several hundred years prior. Astonishingly, we even have a surviving copy of the original text of the decree, dated to the early 3rd century. It's written on papyrus and was probably produced in Egypt not long after the original edict reached the province. There were, it should be remembered, many who were not included in the granting of citizenship. Slaves, who probably made up over 15% of the population, weren't given citizenship. They would become citizens, though, if they were freed. But this had always been the case prior to the decree. The other group, who did not become citizens with the decree, were foreigners within the empire. This could include a wide variety of people: traders, pilgrims, ambassadors, raiders, or tribal people who belonged to a nation separate from Rome. There were probably relatively few who fell into that last example of foreigners, but in the coming centuries, that category of non-citizens would become important. When the Goths and other Germanic people enter the empire in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, many will be given the status of foederati. These were outsiders who might live inside or outside the empire, and were given payment in coin or land in exchange for military service. Their separate status will become a problem as they'll remain divided from the rest of the populace. This distinction prevented integration. But that's all another emperor's problem. Part 4. Sole Reign. Okay, so Caracalla had his brother killed, went on a bloody purge of Rome, and gave everyone, with an asterisk, citizenship. Now, let's do some foreshadowing. In 217, just 6 years into his sole reign, there's the section title, Caracalla will lie alone on the Syrian sand, bleeding to death from an assassin's blade. How did the emperor wind up there in that condition? Let's dive into these intervening years. But we're going to keep the pace up. We've got a lot more to cover this decade. And we're already on section 4. Caracalla broke with the precedent of presenting himself in the philosopher-emperor archetype. He instead leaned in to being a military man. Emperors of the past had maintained a cultured, educated, classy aura. Even his father, Septimius Severus, had modeled himself on the image of Marcus Aurelius. He may have been very different in habit and attitude, but he still wanted to associate himself with this revered philosopher-emperor. Caracalla dropped the act entirely. He became, in all manners, a soldier. And credit where credit's due, Caracalla succeeded in this transformation. When he left Rome, he visited with the soldiers on the frontier. They were impressed by what they saw. He ate humbly, used wooden utensils, carried his own weapons, walked on foot with the soldiers, and was the first to help dig a ditch when one was needed. He showed them that he was one of them. He even ditched the elegant robes of the senatorial class and adopted a soldier's wardrobe, with, of course, the addition of that German hooded overcoat, the Caracalla. Cassius Dio says, "He also invented a costume of his own, which was made in a rather foreign fashion out of small pieces of cloth sewed together into a kind of cloak. And he not only wore this most of the time himself, in consequence of which he was given the nickname Caracallus, but he also prescribed it as the regular dress for the soldiers." On top of gaining the soldiers' respect, as I mentioned earlier, he did increase their pay. For the Praetorians specifically, he gave them a 25% raise. That alone would hit the treasury hard, but that increase fails to take into account that the guard was increased from 10,000 to about 15,000. If you do the math, it comes out to a doubling of payments, 7.2 million drachmae before Caracalla and 14.4 million after. And remember, that's just the Praetorians. The regular soldiers also got a substantial pay increase. To quote Edward Gibbon one more time, "The vigor of the soldiers, instead of being confirmed by the severe discipline of camps, melted away in the luxury of cities. The excessive increase of their pay and donatives exhausted the state to enrich the military order, whose modesty in peace and service in war is best secured by an honorable poverty." The now wealthy Praetorians were governed by two prefects under Caracalla, Adventus, who handled military affairs, and Macrinus, who handled civil matters. The role of Praetorian prefect was increasingly a bureaucratic position. Bad emperors of the past, think Commodus, Caligula, and Nero to a degree, had mostly confined their cruelty and mismanagement to Rome itself. The rest of the empire generally escaped their destructive tendencies. With Caracalla, the provinces weren't so lucky. Caracalla took his show on the road. He left Rome in 213, never to return. As he went from province to province, he caused chaos and mass spending wherever he went. While he lived humbly with the soldiers, when he was in the cities, he expected to be entertained. Many rich families in his path were ruined by fines and confiscations to keep the emperor happy and well-fed. First, he traveled to the Danube, where he organized or oversaw fighting with some of the bordering German and Sarmatian tribes. From the Danube, Caracalla passed south and east into Macedon and Thrace. He had always been cruel, but around this time he began to act more erratically. Maybe it was his upbringing, maybe it was the respect the army gave him, maybe it was spending too much time in Macedonia. But around this time, Caracalla showed signs that his Alexander the Great fascination had turned into a mania or obsession. He organized a special corps of soldiers from Macedon, not into a legion, but into what he called a phalanx, after the fighting style of Alexander. He cut his hair like Alexander, ordered many statues of Alexander erected, sent a letter to the Senate announcing that he was Alexander returned, and even began to persecute Aristotelian philosophers and burn their works because of rumors that Aristotle, a teacher of Alexander, had played a part in Alexander's young death. Yeah, crazy stuff. It wasn't only Alexander, though. Leaving Thrace, he crossed the sea over to Troas, the site of ancient Troy, and visited the tomb of Achilles. Next, he went to Antioch. Wisely, the citizens greeted him warmly. He was, after all, the son of Julia Domna, who was from their own province. Maybe they felt some local patriotism for the young emperor. He stayed a while, but sent a message to Alexandria that he intended to visit them. He wanted to visit the tomb of Alexander, of course. In the meantime, he kidnapped the king of the border kingdom of Osroene and annexed this client state on the border with Parthia into the empire. He tried to do the same thing to the Armenians, but when he imprisoned their ruler, the Armenian people began a low-level uprising against Roman influence challenging Roman control of the western area of Anatolia. Unperturbed and accompanied by an army, Caracalla reached Alexandria in 215. He put on a face of cheer as he entered the city, though his heart was full of malice towards the residents. He first visited the tomb of Alexander, which presumably he had been to before, during his trip there with his father 15 years earlier. Thanks to his father, he wasn't able to actually see the body of Alexander this time. Severus, if you remember, had physically sealed off the inner tomb from all future visitors. This important stop out of the way, he put into action his plan to harm the Alexandrians. He had heard about their mocking him, for his murder of Geta, for his aged mother, and for his imitating Alexander. Caracalla couldn't look past this slight. The Alexandrians, in his mind, all of them, deserved collective punishment. So, he ordered a general massacre. We get a few stories of how this took place, but at the end of the day, the dead numbered in the tens of thousands. The Praetorians who accompanied him were rewarded handsomely for their part in the slaughter. It seems he took his father's final words a little too seriously. Secure the affections of the army, check, and shun all others, definitely check. Part 5. Parthia, one last time. While he sojourned in the east of the empire, Caracalla began to plan a great war with the Parthian Empire. Maybe he was inspired by his hero Alexander. A success in Parthia would bring prestige to himself and the army, just as his father had done 20 years earlier. Of course, Caracalla had to cook up some clever scheme to begin the invasion. Scheming was often his approach. As we've seen in his dealing with Plautianus last decade, his murder of Geta, his kidnapping of the kings of Osroene and Armenia, and trickery was also used to facilitate his massacre of the Alexandrians. The ploy usually involved an enticement and then a trap. For the Parthians, it began with a message that Caracalla was seeking a wife. He asked Artabanus, the Parthian king of kings, for his daughter's hand in marriage. This must have come out of the blue for the Parthians. Never before had a Roman emperor expressed interest in a royal marriage. Artabanus would surely have inquired of the emperor's character and received reports of his cruelty. And the question of why must have been front and center. Was Caracalla trying to unite the two empires through marriage? The Parthian messengers returned to the Roman court with a rejection. Surely, they said, there were plenty of good Roman noblewomen that the emperor could select. But Caracalla persisted. Only a daughter of a king would suit him. After some back and forth, he finally received a yes. Artabanus agreed and called Caracalla his son-in-law. A wedding would be held. Caracalla now crossed the Euphrates and rode out into Parthian territory with his large entourage to meet with the royal family. He was received by the Parthians with pomp and honor. The King of Kings went out to meet the Roman emperor. At the moment of most vulnerability, when armor, horses, and weapons were exchanged for flowers, flutes, and dancing, the trap was sprung. The Roman entourage uncovered their weapons and began to slaughter the Parthians. They fled in terror. Many were slain. Artabanus himself was pulled onto a horse and barely escaped. The Roman soldiers looted and burned the nearby Parthian towns, killing all they found. The Romans went on to ravage a large part of the north of Parthian Mesopotamia, even capturing the strategic fortress of Arbela, modern Erbil, in the Kurdish north of modern Iraq. As the Romans rampaged, the Parthians pulled back behind the Tigris River, recovering and preparing for a response in the protective cover of the Zagros Mountains. When his soldiers had exhausted themselves from this destruction, Caracalla returned to Roman Mesopotamia and sent a letter to the Senate boasting that he had conquered the East and would be adding Parthicus to his titles. Around this time, various seers began to spread the prophecy that Macrinus, who was on campaign with Caracalla as the prefect of the Praetorians, was going to succeed Caracalla as emperor. Not in many years, but shortly. First came an Egyptian who told the emperor this to his face. He was slain for this insult. And second, back in Rome, a seer made the same prophecy. An ally of Caracalla heard the prophecy and sent a letter to the emperor warning him to beware Macrinus. Naturally, though, Caracalla didn't open his own mail. Macrinus screened his correspondences for him. When Macrinus received this letter and began to read, with trembling hands he realized if the emperor read these words, he was a dead man. Macrinus hid the letter and knew he had no choice but to fulfill the prophecy. He selected accomplices and began to plot an assassination. To perform the deed, he chose Martialis, a centurion whose brother Caracalla had just executed. On the 8th of April 216, Caracalla was on the road from Edessa to Carrhae, the city where Crassus of Julius Caesar's day was defeated and killed by the Parthians. Caracalla was traveling to Carrhae to visit the Temple of the Moon of the goddess Selene. He brought only a few horsemen with him as guards. About halfway there, Caracalla needed to relieve himself. He sent his men off and was accompanied by a single attendant. Martialis saw his chance and rushed to the emperor, as if he were delivering a message or responding to his beckoning. As the emperor crouched and went about his business, Martialis pulled out a dagger and stabbed the emperor repeatedly. Bleeding, Caracalla fell to the ground. Martialis made it to his horse and fled, but the imperial bodyguard were able to catch him and cut him down. Caracalla died alone on the Syrian dirt. Rome had no emperor. Part 6. Macrinus and Elagabalus. 3 days passed. Rome had probably not yet heard of Caracalla's death, but the Syrian army was in serious debate of who to acclaim. They could come to no agreement, and they must have begun to worry that if they did not pick someone soon, the legions on the Rhine or the Danube might choose their own candidate, and then they'd be forced to fight in a bloody civil war. A few of the graybeards in the legions probably still remembered the civil wars which brought Severus to power. As the most experienced and highest-ranking officials around, the Praetorian prefects became the obvious candidates. Both of the prefects, Adventus and Macrinus, were there in Syria, accompanying Caracalla's campaign. Adventus quickly refused the offers. He was too old, he said. Of no special talent, he said. And this was probably a wise choice, given the Emperor-to-be's short reign. That left only Macrinus. When he promised to be liberal with the imperial purse, it was a fait accompli. The Praetorians and the soldiers hailed him as emperor. Our sources make it seem like Macrinus just stumbled into assassinating Caracalla and then happened to become emperor. But I think Macrinus did a little more scheming and was a little more involved in the events than all that. Regardless, Macrinus made the right initial moves. He recognized the soldiers' respect for Caracalla and their grief at his murder. Macrinus joined them in their grief, and he paid them off. Macrinus is notable as an emperor for a few reasons, even though his reign will be brief. First, he, like the Severans, came from the provinces. He was a Berber in origin. He was the first emperor never to come to Rome, though I think the shortness of his reign was the cause there. And last, but most significantly, he was an equestrian, not of the senatorial class. This marks the first time a man went directly from equestrian to emperor. Vespasian was born an equestrian, but later became a senator before becoming emperor. And at least that came after a successful campaign and victory in civil war. Macrinus came from nothing and had achieved nothing. So while the Senate was overjoyed by Macrinus' letter informing them that the tyrant Caracalla was dead, their relief soon dried up, and they resented that a low-born man was now their sovereign. He had no legitimacy. Macrinus didn't have time to go on a goodwill campaign and shore up support. Reports arrived that the Parthians approached, ready for revenge. Add to that the instability in Armenia and trouble in Dacia and financial issues. He was in a tough situation. Macrinus gathered what soldiers he could and went out to meet the Parthians. In early summer, the Romans and Parthians met in battle outside Nisibis. This was one of those rare battles where each side was led by their king or emperor. The Romans were outnumbered, but in strength they appeared equally matched. At a range, the Parthians won. Close up, the Romans won. Ironically, the Romans employed a tactic often used by the Parthians and other horsemen. They feigned a retreat. This led the enemy to spring into pursuit. But the Romans dropped caltrops, metal spikes, onto the ground behind them as they fled. The Parthian horses and camels were devastated by this trap, and the Romans turned back and struck them. Still, the fighting continued. After 3 days, Macrinus sent an envoy to the Parthians seeking peace. The Romans informed Artabanus that the treacherous Caracalla was dead, and offered to pay them a large indemnity for a peace. The Parthians agreed and pulled back. Our sources make the battle appear to be a stalemate, but if you read between the lines, it seems the Romans were bested, barely avoiding a real defeat. The payment to the Parthians was cash Macrinus really could have used elsewhere. At the very least, though, the Parthian threat had been solved. Unfortunately for Macrinus, he still had many problems. To mollify the Armenians, he removed the governor Carcalla had installed there, released their king from captivity, and allowed him to return to his country. Similarly, he released Dacian hostages, and this seems to have cooled rebellious tempers there. Conciliation was his solution to Caracalla's provocations. With these acute problems out of the way, Macrinus set his mind to solving the financial Gordian knot. He made the respectable and rare move to try to revalue the currency by increasing the silver in each denarius. The trouble with any financial recovery, though, was the exorbitant cost of the military. Ideally, he would have rolled back pay to what it was under Severus, but he was too wise to try that. A pay decrease for the soldiers was a quick ticket to a shallow grave. Instead of decreasing the active soldiers' pay, he lowered the pay for new recruits to what it had been before Caracalla's increase. Even this angered the veterans, though. At least in their minds, it showed that the soldiers were not his primary concern. And if new recruits had their pay cut, they worried it was only a matter of time till he cut their pay too. Amid these attempts at reform, they also noticed that unlike their beloved Caracalla, Macrinus dressed in fine clothes, ate lavishly, and never jumped in to help do manual labor. He was not one of them. Morale in the army sank. Like Pertinax before him, Macrinus had tried to do too much too soon with too little legitimacy. And he made the mistake of not dispersing the army that Caracalla had gathered in Syria. They sat idle in their camps, which any military commander will tell you is asking for trouble. For the time being, Macrinus ruled from Antioch. This position kept him close to Parthia, Armenia, and the army in Syria, and it kept him at arm's length from any drama with the Senate. Inconveniently for him, also residing in Antioch was Julia Domna, the wife of Severus and mother of Caracalla. She had now lost both of her young sons to bloodshed. This may have been awkward for Macrinus, considering he ordered Caracalla's death. But he allowed her to live there in peace. The grief got to Julia Domna. It seems she suffered from breast cancer, and rather than live on in sorrow and suffering, she chose to starve herself to death. Her entire inheritance, a massive amount of wealth, went to her sister, Julia Maesa. This seemed like a good time for Macrinus to be rid of the Severans for good. Rumors were they were plotting against him. So he forced Julia Maesa out of Antioch, and she returned to her family home city of Amisa. With her went 2 daughters, Julia Soamius and Julia Mamea. Each of these daughters had their own children. Soemia's son was named Bassianus. Mamea's son was named Severus Alexander. The return of these exiles and leftovers of the Severan Dynasty must have made an impact back in Emesa. In this Syrian city, about 100 miles south of Antioch, were stationed a significant number of soldiers. Discontent soldiers. They were upset by the hardship of their forced encampment through the winter by Macrinus. Add to that the general grumbling about Macrinus reducing new soldiers' pay and not respecting the army the way Caracalla had, and you've got a large number of mustered troops feeling deeply frustrated. They were a pile of dry kindling. And the return of Julia Maesa, her daughters, and her grandsons were the spark that set the kindling alight. To make a long story short, Julia Maesa spread the rumor that Bassianus, her grandson, was actually the illegitimate son of Carcalla. The young man did look an awful lot like the late emperor. She called on the soldiers to proclaim him emperor and abandon Macrinus. Her family's immense wealth helped convince any doubters. The Third Gallic Legion mutinied and proclaimed Julia Maesa's young grandson as emperor. Bassianus now assumed Caracalla's imperial name for himself, Antoninus. We'll give this son or great-nephew of Caracalla a proper introduction shortly. Led by him and his grandmother, the rebel legion set off toward Antioch to challenge Macrinus. In the face of this rebellion, Macrinus blinked. Instead of sending a serious response, he took half measures and sent a small cavalry force to intercept the rebel legion. If he had sent a full army to stop them, the rebellion may have fizzled out right there. But when the cavalry detachment reached the legion, instead of fighting, words were exchanged. Whatever was spoken convinced the cavalrymen to kill their commander and switch sides. Now Macrinus was in real trouble. The rebels advanced unopposed almost to Antioch, where Macrinus stationed an army to stop them. At this point, he still had a numbers advantage. Before a battle could begin, however, the legion he led defected to Antoninus and Julia Maesa's side. Only the Praetorians stood beside their prefect. Leading up to the battle, a man named Gannes was given command of the Severan army. Although he had spent his career as a secretary and servant to the Julias, he proved himself a capable general. He succeeded in occupying a pass and was able to draw his troops up in good order. As the fighting began, though, Macrinus and his Praetorians cut through the Severan lines. The rebel legions started to fall back. Panic began to spread. This was the key moment. In most pre-modern warfare, battles were won or lost not by mass killing, but by one side's breaking of nerve. Before this became a rout, Antoninus and Gannes on horseback and Julia Maesa and her two daughters on chariots charged headlong into the battle. The sight of their chosen 14-year-old emperor alongside a 60-year-old Julia Maesa and her daughters charging at the enemy was enough to rally the army. Now it was Macrinus' army's turn to lose morale. The Severans pushed forward, and the Praetorians and Macrinus broke and fled. This was the beginning of the end for the short-reigning emperor. He rode to Antioch, but the victorious rebels were close behind, and fighting began in the city as well. Macrinus fled to the northwest across Anatolia, trying to make it to Rome. He got as far as Chalcedon on the Asian shore of the Bosporus. There he was recognized and captured. His son, whom he had just crowned as co-emperor a few months before, fled in the opposite direction, toward Parthia, but he too was captured and then executed. Macrinus tried to escape captivity, but injured himself in the attempt. He was brought to Cappadocia, where the new emperor ordered him executed. This new emperor was Bassianus, or Antoninus, who was proclaimed as emperor as he entered Antioch in June of 218. His soldiers were eager to sack the rich city, but the young emperor's promise of a payment of 2,000 sesterces each satisfied them. Much of this sum he collected from the people of Antioch. Better to pay a few coins now than have their home and property looted and destroyed, though I'm sure there was plenty of grumbling from the populace. This new Emperor Antoninus soon sent a letter back to Rome to inform the Senate that he was now their emperor. Cassius Dio, a member of the Senate, remarks with consternation the titles the new emperor claimed for himself, without so much as a vote from the Senate. This is a sign of things to come. 2 emperors in a row had been acclaimed by the soldiers, and they merely informed the Senate by letter of their new status. From here on out, the mask is off. The army picks the emperors. The Senate can either rubber stamp the army's decision or be violently replaced. Antoninus spent several months in Antioch, securing his hold on power, contacting the distant legions, appointing governors, etc. And when I say Antoninus did something, it almost certainly means his counselors, including Gannys and his grandmother, made the decisions, and the 14-year-old emperor gave his approval. By late 218, Antoninus and his court left Antioch and slowly traveled overland toward Nicomedia in Bithynia in northwest Anatolia. There they spent the winter in luxury. Come spring of 219, the imperial entourage crossed the Bosporus and passed through Thrace, Moesia, and Pannonia. As they traveled, the new regime was active in rooting out potential opposition. At least 2 governors who had supported Macrinus were executed. The killing was also inward-focused. Gannys, who had been instrumental in the victory over Macrinus, was executed before they reached Italy. Our sources state Gannys was too heavy-handed in imposing a temperate and prudent lifestyle. Without the moderating influence of Gannys, Antoninus will quickly gain a reputation for debauchery. But that scandal still lies in the future. When the imperial company reached Rome in September of 219, an adventus, a ceremonial celebratory entry into the city, was ordered. This was the first time Rome had an emperor in residence in 6 years, and the people celebrated his arrival. As the people of Rome came to know their new emperor, though, they became aware of his oddities. See, I've not been totally forthcoming about Antoninus. This 14-year-old was not just the grand-nephew of Severus, or the supposed illegitimate son of Caracalla. Antoninus was the high priest of the Syrian sun god Elagabal. History remembers him not as Antoninus or Bassianus, but as Elagabalus. You might expect such a young emperor to conform to the culture and religion of the capital, follow the place's modus operandi. But Elagabalus, when in Rome, did not do as the Romans do. Next time, we'll see him attempt to impose his foreign god at the pinnacle of the Roman pantheon. Elagabalus will not reign long, but thanks to the energy of Julia Maesa, he will not be the last emperor of the Severan Dynasty. I'll see you then.